Hello, and welcome to Chicago Shakespeare's Preamble Program. The Preamble Program is presented by the John W. and Jeanne M. Rowe Inquiry and Exploration series. I'm Katie Blankenau, a professor of English at Mount Marty University and a recent graduate of Northwestern. I'll be discussing All's Well That Ends Well, directed by Shana Cooper. First, I'll talk a bit about the historical reception of the play and its heroine. And then I'll explore how this production has led me to think in new ways about the play's genre. Along the way, we'll discuss how All's Well speaks to other works in Shakespeare's canon. There's no scholarly consensus on a date for the writing or the first performance of All's Well That Ends Well. The first recorded performance wasn't until the 18th century, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it wasn't performed in Shakespeare's lifetime. In fact, there are quite a few detailed stage directions in the printed text that indicate that it was performed by Shakespeare's company, the King's Men, possibly with some additions by other dramatists. But we don't know for sure. We also don't know when it was written, because the play wasn't published until it was included in the 1623 First Folio, the great collection of many of Shakespeare's plays that his colleagues produced after his death. The best scholarly guess for when Shakespeare actually wrote the play is the period between 1605 and 1608. So after Measure for Measure, and either shortly before or shortly after he wrote King Lear, to give you a very loose chronology. The First Folio does tell us one thing for certain, though. Under its genre headings, it lists All's Well as a comedy. And indeed, it is a comedy. But some audiences weren't always comfortable with that genre label. In fact, in the 19th and early 20th centuries, All's Well That Ends Well was labeled a problem play, along with Measure for Measure and Troilus and Cressida. You'll notice that in this current production, the costumes for the first half of the performance are strongly influenced by Edwardian clothing styles. And the Edwardian period is the very time period in the early 20th century that considered this play a problem. In a moment, we'll consider why. First, though, let's survey the plot of All's Well to better understand the problems it poses. The play begins in France, where the king is slowly dying, and the Count of Roussillon has just died. We're not off to a very comedic start. The opening scene introduces the widowed Countess of Roussillon, who is saying goodbye to her son, Bertram, the new count, who is going off to join the French king's court. We also meet Helen, a young woman whose father, a famous physician, has also died, leaving her to join the countess's household. We begin then with death and loss, as reflected in the mourning black you'll see worn by the actors at the outset of the play. But things are about to change. A change foreshadowed in this production with a spark of color that, as you'll see, is bestowed by Helen. Helen is our heroine, and she is not quite as mournful as the rest of the household, or at least she's not sad for the same reasons. She has fallen madly in love with Bertram. And while she knows he is of a much higher social class, her passion lets her dream of the future, while the other mourners are focused on the past. And Helen has a plan. She has inherited her father's medicinal prescriptions and believes that she can cure the dying king. Spoiler alert, she does. And her healing abilities give us the first sense that Helen is a bit different from some of Shakespeare's more famous comedic heroines. Viola in Twelfth Night and Rosalind in As You Like It are both verbal dynamos who also disguise themselves as boys, toying with gender and laughing as they fall in love. Rather than disguising herself as a boy, Helen becomes what one character refers to as Dr. She, a pre-modern oxymoron. By inhabiting the role of physician, Helen toys with gender roles in a very different register than her predecessors. She remains outwardly feminine, yet she inhabits a supposedly male role. Significantly, in the text, Helen accomplishes her cure offstage by unknown means. As a result, productions are challenged to display the cure's success, often by having the king re-enter in noticeably better health. Shana Cooper's production, however, lets us see the cure itself in a truly magical way. And in doing so, for me, the production reflects both Helen's power and the awe that early modern audiences might have felt on seeing a woman claim that healing power. The magic in this production has been designed by Dendy, who played Ariel in Chicago Shakespeare's 2015 production of The Tempest, which you may remember. The connection to The Tempest, I think, is appropriate, because All's Well incorporates a similarly magical fairy tale atmosphere. In some ways, the first two acts of All's Well That Ends Well feel akin to Cinderella. In return for healing the king, Helen, a middle-class woman, is offered her choice of men to marry. She chooses Bertram, of course. But we don't get a fairy tale ending. Bertram doesn't want to marry Helen. He insults her, runs off to join the army in Italy, where he tries to woo a young woman named Diana. To add insult to injury, before he leaves, he sends Helen a letter with the riddle-like declaration that he will not be her husband until she can give him the ancestral signet ring that he never removes from his finger, and bear him a child, even though he has refused to consummate the marriage. This midway plot turn poses a problem of genre. Comedies, traditionally, end at the wedding. There are exceptions in Shakespeare's works. The Taming of the Shrew comes rather ominously to mind. But in general, a wedding signals the conclusion of the play. Think, for instance, of the bevy of couples at the end of As You Like It, who all get married on the spot. And As You Like It unequivocally ends well. But this play takes us past that classical comedic ending, as the joyous marriage that one would expect to end the show instead occurs in the middle and falls apart even before the wedding night. And the costume choices, as you'll see, reinforce the irony here as we see the unhappy couple in their beautiful wedding clothes. The title, then, All's Well That Ends Well, acts as both a tease and a promise. It promises that the genre-appropriate ending will occur, even as it teases the audience by acknowledging that their expectations are being thwarted. We'll discuss the ending of the play later on. But first, let's examine why early Edwardian scholars deemed this play such a problem. In part, they were resisting the way Shakespeare is playing with genre expectations. A comedy should put the wedding at the end, not the middle. They may also have been reacting against the play's overt concern with sexuality and the heroine's determination to control her own sex life. Notably, Measure for Measure was also historically deemed a problem play, and like All's Well, it is particularly focused on sex. However, Measure for Measure presents a heroine determined to remain a virgin no matter the cost. In contrast, Helen tells us that she aims to lose her virginity to her own liking, that is, with the person she desires. As a woman who is not rich, not an aristocrat, but who is in love with a count, Helen's desire is not likely to be fulfilled. Wealth and bloodline were the determining factors within the upper classes of Shakespeare's society and within the world of the French court in which the play is set. Other Shakespearean heroines tend to be of similar social status as the men they love. Helen is not. Yet despite the obstacle of a rigid class hierarchy, Helen idealistically imagines that love will conquer all. In an attempt at self-encouragement, she asks, "Whoever strove to show her merit, that did miss her love." The verbs Helen uses, strove and show, are somewhat surprising verbs for an early modern woman to use. Helen's decision to strive and win her love by showing that she deserves it displays a self-confidence and ambition that were deemed more appropriate virtues for men than for women in matters of love and sex. So while Helen doesn't dress as a boy, she is still pushing the boundaries of a woman's place in early modern England. In fact, Victorian and Edwardian audiences, too, deemed her character pushy and aggressive, sure signs of that perennial problem, a woman who makes her own choices. Of course, Helen's approach to courtship doesn't initially work well for her within the rigid formalities of the French court. And Helen ultimately blames herself for Bertram's decision to flee their marriage and join the French soldiers fighting in Italy. In remorse, Helen embarks on a pilgrimage until she ends up in Italy as well. There, she meets a community of women and a far more congenial atmosphere than the French court. And in fact, one of those women is Diana, who has caught Bertram's eye. But rather than seeing Helen as some kind of competitor, Diana refreshingly befriends her. So, while for early 20th century readers, Helen's determined pursuit of a man turned her play into a problem, Diana and her mother instead help Helen find solutions. It's fitting, then, that as you'll notice, the costumes of the Italian women shift away from the more formal Edwardian outfits of the opening scenes. They're airy, bright, and feminine. For me, then, watching the various characters in this production shed their Edwardian rigidity is a form of talking back to the 19th and 20th century restrictions on female sexuality that so dominated the historical discussion of this play. We can read another important component of the production in light of the historic debate about the play's genre. Some of Shakespeare's earlier, more famous romantic comedies feature a natural space in which lovers' problems can be worked out despite or because of gender swaps and fairy potions. And As You Like It, for example, the characters escape the confines of the court and hide in the forest of Arden, where they learn to fall in love. In A Midsummer Night's Dream, desperate lovers flee to the woods, where fairy magic sorts out their conflicts, after first messing them up, and ultimately pairs everyone off to their satisfaction. In both these plays, the natural world becomes a place of freedom, playfulness, and desire. As you'll see, Andrew Boyce, the scenic designer of this production of All's Well That Ends Well, has created a distinct kind of natural space within the Italian world of the second half of the play. In the first acts, as you can see, a beautiful but formal cloth curtain characterizes the French spaces. But in the second half, the set is reconfigured with a gorgeous, natural kind of curtain, as you'll see. Admittedly, the young French courtiers are ostensibly in Italy not to enjoy nature, but to wage war. But the choreography of this production, designed by Stephanie Martinez, reimagines the martial scenes with exuberant dance numbers. The result, for me, is distinct from the natural, free spaces of Shakespeare's early comedies, but still retains their sense of possibility and play. It creates a natural world familiar from the Forest of Arden. For me, then, the staging extends the promise of the play's title once again, reassuring us with the reminder that, in Shakespeare, natural spaces can produce happy, if unconventional, results. Nevertheless, whether this play does in fact end well remains a matter of ongoing debate. And the answer, for many audiences today, depends not on Helen, but on Bertram. The first time I read the play, like many people, I came away wondering what on earth a self-made, talented woman like Helen could possibly see in Bertram. He is a bit of a snob. He first ignores her, then abandons her, and later lies to cover up mistakes. However, with this production, Shana Cooper and the cast have helped me think about Bertram and even the play's genre in a new way. Dante Gemmett, who plays Bertram, is a talented young performer who is much closer to Bertram's implied age than we tend to see in most performances. We know that the character of Bertram is supposed to be younger than 21, something that's very easy to forget when simply reading the play. And I'll explain the evidence for his age in a moment. But this production, for me, emphasizes just how important Bertram's youth is to this play. Recently, I've begun teaching a class on young adult literature, which is also called YA Lit. It's a term for the genre of literature directed at people in their late teens and early 20s. The class was initially a bit of a daunting prospect for me because I'm a Shakespeare scholar, and YA Lit is generally regarded as a 20th century American invention. However, as I've learned more about the genre of YA Lit, I found myself particularly intrigued by its resonances with this play and especially with this production. In fact, I suggest that rather than a problem or even a comedy, we might also think of All's Well as a work belonging to the YA genre. Usually, when we think of the most young adult Shakespeare play, we think of Romeo and Juliet. Their doomed love story certainly has appealed to teenagers over the centuries. But I believe the primary themes of young adult literature are operating very strongly in All's Well That Ends Well, a play that, I would argue, explores young adulthood in a more complex way than Romeo and Juliet. In YA Lit, young adults don't just fall in love. They must also learn to negotiate the power structures of their world. They must reevaluate their bonds with family or friends, replacing childish relationships with adult ones. And through these struggles, they must grow in self-knowledge. I'd like to explore, then, the ways that these three characteristics of YA Lit map onto All's Well That Ends Well, and whether, in doing so, we can illuminate the people in the play. Shana Cooper's vision and Dante Gemmett's performance in particular as Bertram, for me, emphasize the fact that this play is a coming-of-age narrative for Bertram as much as it is for Helen. Bertram's opening lines, in fact, contextualize him within a controversial power structure of Shakespeare's day. As I said earlier, at the beginning of the play, Bertram is preparing to go to the court of the King of France. He's leaving home because at the death of his father, the previous count, Bertram has become the king's ward, and the king has become his guardian. In Elizabethan and Jacobean England, upper-class minors became wards if their fathers died before the minor had reached their majority. A minor who inherited lands and wealth wasn't considered mature enough to manage such power. And this seems reasonable enough. But under the legal wardship system, upper-class adults could purchase the guardianship of the minor from the crown. In doing so, this random adult became the guardian of the minor and their inheritance, and the guardian chose who the minor married. For boys, the age of majority was 21, so we know that Bertram must be younger than that. Bertram is the ward of the king himself, which indicates the importance of his family wealth and lands. And the countess is not Bertram's guardian, because a mother could only be given their child as a ward if, like everyone else, she bid for their guardianship and won it. But the king could reserve that guardianship for himself. At the start of the play, then, the countess, too, has been robbed of power. Her husband's absence not only leaves her grieving and alone, but also without him beside her. The misogynist state has erased her maternal authority. As you might expect, the wardship system was often abused because the guardian's power over the ward was so total. And in his first lines, Bertram laments, "I am now in ward, evermore in subjection." On the one hand, we see Bertram's youth when declaring that his subjection will last evermore. When you're young, a few years seems like forever. But Bertram is also not wrong, because without his consent, the king can order him to marry whoever he chooses, thus tying Bertram evermore to an unsought marriage. A ward was powerless, subjected to the authority of members of the older generation who might not have the young person's best interests at heart. Bertram, I think, senses this, and his frustration is evident in the performance, even as he tries to make the best of things. However, Bertram is not the only ward in the play. When introducing Helen, the Countess explains that Helen's deceased father bequeathed her to the Countess as a ward. Because Helen is not a noblewoman and has not inherited land, her guardianship would not have been overseen by the monarch. But her position in the Countess's household is still not of her own choosing. However much the Countess loves her, like Bertram, Helen is a ward, bequeathed, like any of her father's material possessions, to a higher status adult. Thus, when both Helen and Bertram are mourning their fathers, they're also mourning their subjection to a non-parental authority whose decisions can determine the courses of their lives. Like good YA heroes, they fight that subjection to assert their own authority. In fact, at court, Helen learns to use her healing abilities to, surprisingly, establish herself in a position of power over the king. Moreover, she even gains a supportive maternal figure in the Countess. So despite her gender and class, in the first half of the play, Helen is able to successfully negotiate some of the power structures of her society. Bertram, in contrast, is powerless and primed to rebel. He fumes at being told he is too young to join the army. His very impatience perhaps suggests that he is too young, yet his dream of becoming a soldier may also be inflected by his memories of his father and his need to live up to those memories. The king knew his father, and he praises the old count's military abilities. At the same time, the king also disparages the manners of young people in a speech that is sort of the Shakespearean equivalent of kids these days. The king tells Bertram that he will be like a father to him, but as we see, he is not willing to grant young people the agency to make their own decisions. Bertram strains for freedom and makes plans to run away, and then, in a final straw, learns that he must be married against his will. It reminds me of all the YA stories of princesses running off to escape arranged marriages. Bertram is in the same position here. The difference is that we know and respect Helen as well. So rather than primarily blaming Bertram for abandoning Helen, I think we can instead see him as simultaneously fighting for the power of self-determination in the face of an authority that considers him too immature to know what's good for him. As in much young adult literature today, we're faced with a conundrum. Both parties are right. Bertram is immature, but he also deserves to make his own decisions. Shakespeare and Dante Giomet together in this production illuminate a young adult fighting the authorities that limit his choices and making mistakes along the way. One of Bertram's mistakes is a fully fledged character in his own right, Bertram's close friend Parolles. Parolles, whose name means words in French, is the center of a subplot that runs throughout the middle of the play. In a reflection of his name, Parolles is all words. He's a deeply insecure, classically comic figure who boasts as often as he opens his mouth. As I mentioned earlier, a second characteristic of young adult literature is the replacement of childish relationships with adult ones. In Parolles and Bertram's relationship, we see Bertram's naive infatuation with an older friend who claims to know it all. As he gradually discovers that Parolles may be less than reliable, the young count is faced with the fact that if he was wrong about his best friend, he may have been wrong about a lot of other things too. But Parolles, of course, is not all bad. Shakespeare is too fond of fools to craft a wholly unlikable one. For me, this production highlighted the way in which Parolles, in effect, achieves the goal of YA literature, self-knowledge. After his own clashes with authority and the losses of his friends, the braggart Parolles decides to be himself. I won't spoil the way this production represents that decision, but I'll say that while Parolles might have come to self-knowledge a little past young adulthood, it's better late than never. It occurred to me, while watching this production's sympathetic yet clear-eyed depiction of both Helen and Bertram, that these are as real a pair of young lovers as Romeo and Juliet, and probably more so. Each of them is fighting for their happiness, yet neither truly knows what will make them happy, and they hurt each other deeply as a result. These young adults are learning to communicate, often unsuccessfully. Watch for their only full conversation in the first half of the play, which doesn't occur until after their marriage. As you watch, pay attention to the way they struggle to communicate their feelings. Their lack of communication extends throughout the play. Helen, as I said, blames herself for Bertram's decision to escape to Italy and endure the dangers of war. But Bertram, as we see, already wanted to do so. Helen, therefore, does not understand Bertram any more than he comprehends her good qualities. As you'll see, Helen later plays a trick on Bertram that is problematic in its own right, and Bertram commits his own betrayals. The question by the end becomes whether these young adults have learned from their experiences to develop the self-knowledge they need to understand one another. The plot of this play gives them plenty of opportunity. Early on, Helen muses that the court's a learning place, but so is Italy. As they learn from others and face their mistakes, both characters struggle to decide how their journey will end. Yet the ending of the play, in this production, is left for you to interpret. For me, considering the play within the context of the YA genre somewhat resolves the promise and the tease of the play's title. The joy of young adult literature is that the characters have the rest of their lives to continue to grow. All may end well, But the best YA stories only ever end with a beginning. Thank you for listening, and enjoy the show.